The weathered poster fluttered against the general store's bulletin board like a desperate prayer, its edges worn from the harsh Colorado wind that swept down from the Rocky Mountain peaks. Cook wanted. Reliable woman for widower's ranch. Good. Wages, separate quarters, references required. Apply to Benjamin Crawford, Pine Ridge Ranch. Ben had written those words 3 weeks ago with hands that still trembled when he thought too long about the empty kitchen, where his beloved Martha used to hum while kneading bread, where her laughter once filled the spaces between the creak of floorboards and the whistle of wind through the eaves. 6 months had passed since the fever took her. 6 months of burned meals and cold coffee, of a house that echoed with memories and the ghostly scent of her lavender soap. He needed help. Practical, efficient help that would restore order to his household without stirring up the grief he'd carefully buried beneath layers of work and whiskey. What he absolutely did not need was complications. And the young woman standing on his porch that crisp October morning, clutching a bundle of blankets that squirmed and mewled with obvious life, was nothing if not a complication. She couldn't have been more than 19, with auburn hair escaping from a threadbare bonnet and green eyes that held a desperation so deep it made Ben's chest tighten with unwelcome recognition. Her dress, once probably blue, had faded to the color of storm clouds, and her boots were worn thin enough that he could see her toes through the cracked leather. But it was the bundle in her arms that made Ben's heart sink. A baby. No more than a few months old, wrapped in what looked like pieces of an old quilt sewn together with more hope than skill. "Mr. Crawford?" Her voice was soft but steady, despite the exhaustion that lined her young face. "I've come about the cook position." Ben's jaw tightened. This was exactly what he'd been trying to avoid. Some young woman with troubles of her own complications that would disrupt the careful routine he'd built to keep his grief at bay. "The position requires references," he said curtly, though his eyes kept drifting to the baby whose tiny fist had emerged from the blankets. "And it's for a single woman. I run a working ranch, not a nursery." The girl's chin lifted with a pride that belied her obvious desperation. "I have references, sir, and I can cook better than most women twice my age. As for my son, he won't be any trouble. He sleeps through most everything, and I can work with him right beside me." Something in her voice, a thread of steel beneath the exhaustion, made Ben look at her more closely. There was strength in the set of her shoulders, determination in the way she held her ground despite his clear reluctance. But more than that, there was something familiar in her desperation, the same barely controlled panic he'd felt in those first days after Martha's death, when the world seemed to tilt sideways and nothing made sense anymore. What would you do if someone's desperation mirrored your own deepest need? The baby's cry pierced the afternoon air like a knife, and Ben watched the young woman's face transform with a tenderness so pure it made his throat constrict. She shifted the bundle with practiced ease, murmuring soft words that quieted the infant immediately, and Ben found himself remembering Martha's hands performing the same gentle ritual with the children they'd lost, the babies who'd never drawn breath beyond their first moments in this harsh world. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "Rosalind McKenna, sir. Rose. And this is my son, Thomas." She paused, then added with quiet dignity, "I'm a widow, Mr. Crawford. My husband died in a mining accident back in Leadville. I've been working as a cook in the mining camps, but—" She hesitated, and Ben saw fear flicker across her features. "The conditions weren't suitable for a baby. I need honest work, somewhere safe." The lie came so smoothly that Ben almost believed it, but he'd seen enough of life to recognize the careful omission of truth. No ring marked her finger, and the haunted look in her eyes spoke of running from something more dangerous than unsuitable working conditions. Still, he'd posted that notice because he was desperate, and desperation, he'd learned, made strange bedfellows. "Can you actually cook?" he asked bluntly. Rose's shoulders straightened. "Give me a chance to prove it, one meal. If it's not to your satisfaction, I'll move on and won't trouble you further." Ben studied her for a long moment, weighing his need for help against his instinct to avoid complications. The baby, Thomas, had settled into sleep, his tiny face, peaceful against his mother's shoulder, and something about the sight tugged at a part of Ben's heart he'd thought permanently frozen. Martha had always wanted children, had mourned each pregnancy that ended too soon, had filled their home with the love meant for the babies they'd never been able to keep. "You can stay in the cabin behind the main house," he said finally, surprising himself with the decision. "It's small but clean. 1-week trial. If your cooking is as good as you claim, we'll discuss permanent arrangements." Relief flooded Rose's features so completely that Ben felt a pang of conscience. Whatever she was running from had driven her to near desperation, and he recognized something of his own raw need in her gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Crawford. You won't regret this." Ben turned away before the hope in her eyes could weaken his resolve to keep this arrangement strictly business. "Jake will help you get settled. Supper's at 6. Don't disappoint me, Miss McKenna." As he walked away, he heard her whisper something to the baby, her voice thick with tears of relief, and Ben found himself wondering what kind of danger could drive a young mother to accept work from a stranger in the middle of nowhere. Whatever it was, he told himself, it wasn't his concern. He needed a cook, nothing more. The aroma that greeted Ben when he returned to the house that evening stopped him dead in his tracks. For 6 months his kitchen had smelled of nothing but coffee grounds and the lingering staleness of loneliness. Now it was alive with the sense of his childhood: fresh bread, roasted chicken with herbs, something sweet and comforting that made his mouth water and his eyes sting with unexpected emotion. Rose stood at the stove, baby Thomas sleeping peacefully, in a makeshift cradle she'd fashioned from a laundry basket, her movements efficient and confident as she stirred something that smelled like heaven itself. She'd tied one of Martha's old aprons around her waist, and the sight of it should have felt like a violation. Instead, it felt like the kitchen was waking up from a long, cold sleep. "I hope you don't mind," she said, without turning around, somehow sensing his presence. "I found some herbs growing wild behind the cabin, and there were preserves in your cellar that just needed a gentle touch to bring back to life." Ben realized he was staring and forced himself to move to the table, where she'd set a place with Martha's good china, dishes he hadn't used since the funeral. The table itself gleamed with a polish he'd forgotten it possessed, and there were wildflowers in a mason jar, simple but somehow perfect. "Sit, please," Rose said, wiping her hands on the apron. "Everything's ready." The first bite transported Ben back to Sunday dinners at his grandmother's house, to the kind of cooking that nourished the soul as well as the body. The chicken was tender and perfectly seasoned, the bread still warm from the oven with a crust that cracked satisfyingly under his teeth. But it was the dessert, a simple apple cobbler made from fruit he'd forgotten he had, that nearly undid him. "This is," he began, then stopped, not trusting his voice. Rose watched him anxiously, Thomas stirring slightly in his basket. "It's acceptable." Ben looked up at her, this young woman who'd appeared on his doorstep like an answer to a prayer he hadn't known he was praying. "It's the best meal I've had in 6 months," he said honestly. "Maybe longer." Relief transformed her face, making her look even younger. "I'm glad. I was worried. I know you're used to your wife's cooking, and I didn't want to presume." Ben's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "How did you know about my wife?" Rose's cheeks flushed pink. "Mrs. Jameson mentioned it when I asked directions to your ranch. I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Crawford. I know how it feels to lose someone you love." There was something in her voice, a depth of understanding that suggested her own acquaintance with grief, and Ben found himself really looking at her for the first time. Beneath the exhaustion and worry, he saw strength, intelligence, and a kind of quiet grace that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with Martha all those years ago. 1 week, he said, returning to his meal. We agreed on 1 week. But even as he spoke the words, Ben knew that Rose McKenna and her baby had already begun to fill the empty spaces in his house, and possibly in his heart as well. The days that followed established a rhythm that Ben hadn't realized he'd been craving. Rose moved through the house like a gentle storm, bringing order without disruption, comfort without intrusion. She learned his preferences quickly. Coffee strong enough to wake the dead, eggs over easy, the way he liked his shirts pressed with just enough starch to stand up to ranch work. But more than that, she brought life back to spaces that had felt like a mausoleum. Thomas proved to be an unexpectedly easy baby, content to sleep in his basket while his mother worked, or to lie on a blanket watching the play of sunlight through the kitchen windows. Ben found himself timing his trips to the house around the baby's feeding schedule, drawn by sounds he'd thought he'd never hear again. A woman's soft humming, the gentle murmur of lullabies, the contented sighs of an infant well-fed and loved. Rose had a gift for making the ordinary feel special. She turned simple meals into occasions, setting the table with care, finding beauty in wildflowers and arrangement of fruit, creating an atmosphere of home that Ben had thought died with Martha. She mended his clothes with tiny, perfect stitches, organized his cluttered study without disturbing his important papers, and somehow made the whole house smell like lavender and fresh bread. "She's a treasure," Mrs. Jameson confided to Ben when she came calling one afternoon, finding Rose in the garden with Thomas strapped to her back, harvesting the last of the winter squash. "That girl's been through something terrible. You can see it in her eyes, but she's got steel in her spine. Reminds me of my own daughter at that age." Ben had noticed the same thing, the way Rose's hands sometimes shook when she thought no. One was looking, how she startled at unexpected sounds, the way she always seemed to be listening for something threatening to approach. Whatever had driven her to his door, it had left marks on her soul that hard work and kindness were slowly beginning to heal. In the evenings, after supper was cleared and the dishes washed, Rose would sit in the parlor with Thomas, reading aloud from Ben's books or simply talking to the baby in the soft, musical voice that had become the soundtrack to Ben's days. He'd taken to lingering in the kitchen longer than necessary, reluctant to retreat to his empty bedroom, drawn by the domesticity he'd thought he'd lost forever. One evening, he found the courage to join them, settling into Martha's old chair, with a cup of coffee and the newspaper. Rose looked up in surprise, then smiled, the first truly relaxed smile he'd seen from her. "I hope we're not disturbing you," she said. "Not at all," Ben replied, and meant it. For the first time since Martha's death, the silence in his house felt peaceful rather than oppressive, filled with the gentle sounds of life being lived rather than simply endured. The connection between them grew like spring grass after rain, slowly, at first, then with increasing strength and undeniable presence. Ben began to look forward to their conversations over the morning coffee, the way Rose listened with genuine interest when he talked about the ranch, the cattle, his plans for expanding the herd come spring. She had opinions, too, thoughtful observations, about land management and animal husbandry that surprised him with their insight. "My father had a small farm back in Ohio," she explained one morning as they watched the sunrise paint the mountains gold. "I learned more than just cooking in that kitchen. I learned that taking care of things, land, animals, people, it's all connected." Thomas had grown fond of Ben, too, his tiny face lighting up when the rancher entered the room, his small fists reaching for Ben's weathered fingers with a trust that both thrilled and terrified the lonely widower. Ben found himself offering to hold the baby while Rose worked, marveling at how natural it felt to have that small weight against his shoulder, how right it seemed when Thomas fell asleep to the sound of his voice. "He likes you," Rose observed, one evening as Ben gently rocked the sleeping infant. "He's not usually so comfortable with strangers." Ben looked down at the baby's peaceful face, feeling something shift in his chest. "He's a good boy. You've done well with him." Rose's smile was soft and sad. "I try. It's not easy raising a child alone. Sometimes I wonder if I'm enough." The vulnerability in her voice made Ben's throat tighten. "You're more than enough. Any child would be lucky to have you as a mother." Their eyes met across the lamplight, and Ben felt something pass between them. Recognition, understanding, the beginning of something deeper than employer and employee, more complex than simple friendship. Rose was the first to look away, her cheeks flushing pink, but not before Ben saw the longing in her eyes that matched the ache growing in his own heart. "Mr. Crawford," she began, then stopped. "Ben," he said quietly, "I think, after everything, you can call me Ben." Rose's smile was like sunrise. "Ben," she repeated, and the sound of his name in her voice felt like a benediction. They sat, in comfortable silence, the baby sleeping between them, and Ben realized that somewhere in the past weeks, the careful walls he'd built around his heart had begun to crumble. Rose McKenna and her son had become more than just the help he'd hired. They'd become the family he'd thought he'd never have again, filling spaces in his life he hadn't even realized were empty. The fragile peace shattered like glass on stone when Silas Garrett rode into the yard on a gray November morning, his expensive suit and cold eyes as out of place in the ranch setting as a snake in a cradle. Ben was mending fence when he heard Rose's sharp intake of breath from the garden, and he looked up to see her face drain of all color, her hands instinctively moving to gather Thomas closer to her chest. The man dismounting from the black stallion was everything Ben instinctively distrusted: smooth, well-dressed, with the kind of smile that never reached the eyes and hands that looked like they'd never done an honest day's work. "Well, well," Silas drawled, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "If it isn't little Rose, you've led me quite a chase, my dear." Rose took a step backward, her face pale as winter snow. "Mr. Garrett, I fulfilled my contract. I worked off my debt." Silas's laugh was like breaking glass. "Oh, my sweet. Girl, you misunderstood our arrangement. You see, your debt keeps growing. Room, board, the doctor's fees when you were indisposed. And then there's the matter of you running off with property that belongs to me." Ben's blood turned to ice as understanding dawned. The baby. Silas was claiming the baby was his. Rose's. Arms tightened protectively around Thomas, and Ben saw terror replace the peace that had finally begun to settle in her eyes. "Thomas is my son," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't care what papers you think you have." Silas stepped closer, and Ben moved instinctively toward them, his hand moving to the gun at his hip. "The papers I have say otherwise. Rose. They say you're my property until your debt is paid, and anything born under my roof belongs to me. The boy comes with you." The casual cruelty in his voice made Ben's vision blur with rage. This was what Rose had been running from. Not just an abusive employer, but a man who claimed to own her and her child like livestock. "She's not going anywhere with you," Ben said, his voice deadly quiet as he approached. "This is my land and she's under my protection." Silas's cold eyes assessed Ben with the disdain of a man who thought wealth could buy anything, including people. "And you are?" "Benjamin Crawford. This is my ranch and Rose works for me now. Whatever arrangement you had with her is over." Silas's smile was predatory. "I'm afraid that's not how the law works, cowboy. I have legal documents proving Rose McKenna owes me 3 years of labor, and that makes her my responsibility. As for the boy..." He reached into his coat and pulled out an official-looking paper. "Birth certificate names me as the father. That makes him my son." The lie hung in the air like poison, and Ben felt rage unlike anything he'd experienced since Martha's death. This man was threatening to destroy the family that had brought light back into his world, and Ben would die before he let that happen. What do you think Ben should do when the law itself seems corrupted against the innocent? The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring ready to snap, 3 adults and an innocent child caught in a web of lies and legal manipulation that threatened to destroy everything good that had grown between them. Ben's hand rested on his gun, but he knew that violence, no matter how justified it felt, would only give Silas the excuse he needed to involve the territorial authorities. Rose stood frozen between them, Thomas beginning to fuss as if sensing the danger that surrounded him. "Those papers don't mean anything here," Ben said, his voice steady despite the fury coursing through his veins. "Colorado territory doesn't recognize debt peonage, and no man owns another person's labor against their will." Silas's smile was sharp as a blade. "Perhaps, but they do recognize paternal rights, and until someone can prove otherwise, that boy is legally mine." Ben saw Rose flinch as if struck, and something cold and implacable settled in his chest. He'd lost too much in his life to cruel twists of fate and legal technicalities. He would not lose this family to a lie wrapped in official seals. Jake, he called to his ranch hand, who'd been watching the confrontation from the barn. Ride to town and fetch Sheriff Morrison. Tell him we need him here immediately. Silas's confidence flickered for the first time. That won't be necessary. I'm simply collecting what's mine and leaving. Nothing here is yours, Ben said flatly. And you're not taking anything or anyone from my property. The next hour passed like a lifetime. Rose retreated to the house with Thomas, her face white, with terror, while Ben and Silas faced each other across the yard like gunfighters at high noon. When Sheriff Morrison finally arrived, dusty and irritated from the hard ride, Ben felt some of his tension ease. Wade Morrison was a fair man, more interested in justice than legal technicalities. "What's the situation, Ben?" the sheriff asked, his eyes taking in the expensive stranger and the obvious tension. Silas stepped forward before Ben could speak. "I'm here to collect a woman and child who belong to me. I have the proper documentation." He handed over the papers with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. Sheriff Morrison studied the documents carefully, his weathered face growing increasingly grim. "These look official," he admitted, and Ben felt his heart sink. "But they also look suspicious. Birth certificate filed in a town I've never heard of, debt contract that reads more like a slavery agreement than honest employment." Silas's mask of civility began to slip. "I assure you, Sheriff, everything is completely legal." Morrison's eyes hardened. "Maybe. But I've seen enough forged documents in my time to know the smell of them. And this whole situation stinks worse than a dead skunk." Ben felt hope begin to bloom in his chest. "What are you saying, Wade?" The sheriff looked at Silas, with undisguised disgust. "I'm saying this man can take his fancy papers and get off Crawford property. Rose McKenna is a free woman under territorial law, and if he wants to challenge that, he can do it through proper legal channels. Until then, he's trespassing." Silas's face darkened with rage. "You're making a mistake, Sheriff. I have powerful friends in Denver. This won't end here." Morrison's hand moved to his gun. "Then you'd better start riding toward Denver, because your business here is finished." Justice arrived, not with thunder and lightning, but with the quiet, authority of law properly applied and the backing of a community that had learned to value character over legal documents. Silas Garrett's threats and bluster crumbled in the face of Sheriff Morrison's unwavering commitment to what was right rather than what was merely written on paper. As the black stallion carried its defeated rider toward the horizon, Ben felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. Rose emerged from the house. Thomas still clutched protectively in her arms, her eyes wide with disbelief that the nightmare was finally over. "Is he really gone?" she whispered, as if speaking too loudly might summon Silas back from the gathering dusk. Sheriff Morrison nodded grimly. "He's gone and he won't be back. Men like that are cowards at heart. They only prey on people they think can't fight back. But you've got protection now, people who care about you." His eyes moved meaningfully to Ben. "That makes all the difference." After the sheriff departed, Ben and Rose stood together in the yard, watching the last light fade from the western mountains. Thomas had fallen asleep in his mother's arms, finally peaceful now that the threat had passed, and the silence between the two adults was filled with all the words they'd been afraid to speak while danger loomed. "I need to tell you the truth," Rose said finally, her voice barely audible above the evening wind. "About Thomas, about why I was really running." Ben reached out and gently touched her arm. "You don't owe me explanations, Rose. What matters is that you're safe now, both of you." Rose shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes. "You deserve to know. Silas. He wasn't just my employer. He forced himself on me. And when Thomas was born, he claimed the baby as his own, said I owed him for room and board, that I'd work for him until the debt was paid. But the debt kept growing and I realized he never intended to let me go." Ben's jaw tightened with renewed anger, but his voice remained gentle. "That's not debt, Rose. That's slavery. And it's over now." Rose looked up at him, and in her eyes Ben saw not just gratitude but something deeper, the kind of love that grew from shared struggle, mutual respect, and the daily choice to build something beautiful together. "I love you, Ben," she said, simply. I know it's too soon. I know you're still grieving Martha, but I needed you to know. Ben's heart swelled with an emotion so powerful, it nearly brought him to his knees. I love you too, Rose. And Thomas, you've both brought light back into a world I thought had gone permanently dark. His voice grew stronger with certainty. Marry me, not because you need protection or I need a cook, but because I can't imagine my life without you in it. Rose's smile was radiant as the sunrise. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you, Ben Crawford. I'll marry you because I love you, because Thomas needs a father, and because together we can build something beautiful. As if summoned by their joy, Thomas stirred in his mother's arms, his tiny hand reaching toward Ben with the trust of a child who knew he was home. Ben took the baby gently, marveling again at how perfectly the small weight fit against his shoulder, how right it felt to hold this child who would soon be his son in every way that mattered. 2 years later, the ranch that had once echoed with loneliness now rang with the sounds of family. Thomas's delighted laughter as he chased chickens in the yard, Rose's voice humming as she tended her expanded garden, and the everyday conversations that made a house into a home. Ben stood on the porch in the early morning light, watching his wife hang laundry while their son played at her feet, and felt a contentment so deep it seemed to flow from the very earth beneath his boots. Thomas had grown into a sturdy toddler with his mother's green eyes and a fearless spirit that reminded Ben of himself at that age. The boy called him Papa now, and the word never failed to fill Ben's heart with fierce pride and protective love. Rose had bloomed like a flower in good soil, her natural grace and strength given room to flourish in the safety and love they'd built together. She ran the household with quiet efficiency, but more than that, she'd become Ben's partner in every sense, helping with ranch decisions, offering insights that often proved invaluable, standing beside him as they built their future together. The legal formalities had been surprisingly simple once Sheriff Morrison testified to Silas's fraudulent claims. Rose's marriage to Ben automatically granted Thomas his name and legal protection, and the forged documents that had once threatened their happiness were exposed for the lies they'd always been. Dr. Whitman, who'd overseen Thomas's care since infancy, provided testimony about the boy's true paternity that put any remaining doubts to rest. The community of Bitter Creek had embraced their little family with warmth that still surprised Ben. Mrs. Jameson had become like a grandmother to Thomas, spoiling him with cookies and stories, while Reverend Sterling had performed their wedding ceremony with joy evident in every word. Even the schoolmarm, Adelaide Foster, had already begun making plans for Thomas's education, declaring him one of the brightest children she'd ever encountered. "What are you thinking about?" Rose asked, appearing beside him with 2 cups of coffee and that smile that still made his heart skip beats. "Just counting my blessings," Ben replied, wrapping his arm around her waist and pulling her close. 2 years ago, I thought my life was over. Now I can't imagine being any happier. Rose leaned into his embrace, watching Thomas attempt to catch a butterfly with serious determination. "Mrs. Jameson asked me yesterday if we were planning to give Thomas a brother or sister soon." Ben felt his heart leap with hope. "And what did you tell her?" Rose's smile was mysterious and full of promises. "I told her she'd have to wait and see, but I think Tommy would make an excellent big brother, don't you?" The kiss Ben gave her tasted like hope and happiness, like the promise of all the tomorrows they would share on this land that had witnessed their love story unfold. In the distance, Thomas shrieked with delight as he finally caught his butterfly, then immediately opened his hands to let it fly free, a gesture that seemed to capture everything beautiful about childhood and second chances. Sometimes the heart finds exactly what it needs in the most unexpected packages, and love writes the most beautiful stories when we're brave enough to let it in.